holds barred and give us the complete story of what in the world is going on with gang stalking, with surveillance, electronic surveillance, this harassment. And I know, again, I've heard you talk, but I know that folks in our audience many have not, and we have a worldwide audience. So, where do you want to start?
Well, I think probably a good start for those of your listeners that haven't heard of this topic is kind of a brief description of what we're really talking about when we say gang stalking, or actually I prefer the term organized stalking or electronic harassment. And that's essentially, there's a large group of individuals, and this is worldwide, it's not just here. I get emails every day from just about every country on the planet. Is essentially a group of people that have noticed themselves to be stalked by, organized stalkers. This isn't loved ones, this isn't an ex-spouse, or it may be private investigators, and I know in the United States usually is private investigators that are accessing some technology that they've been allowed to access that is CIA, NSA-based technology. That's electromagnetic weaponry. That allows for you to be tracked by your brainwaves or your EEG, and allows for your EEG to be backed by its electromagnetic weaponry. That allows for you to be tracked by your brainwaves or your EEG, and allows for your EEG to be manipulated. And most of these people will notice the stalking first, then notice tinnitus or ringing in the ears, and slowly the ringing in the ears degrades down to hearing the voices of the people that are actually surveilling you, typically harassing you, describing your whereabouts in a building or what your plans are, or what you're doing, what you're wearing. That combined with directed energy attack, which would be burning of the skin, burning of the eyes, burning of the genitals, involuntary body motion, heart speeding up and down, some severe reflux or heartburn that comes and goes without treatment, whether you treat it or not, headaches, blurred vision, all of it geared to basically mimic delusional disorder or schizophrenia. And it seems like the goal in most of these victims is delusion. All of it geared to basically mimic delusional disorder or schizophrenia. And it seems like the goal in most of these victims is to have them discredited. And oftentimes they'll plant people around the victim in their neighborhood or in their occupation to verbally discredit them, spread rumors, plant seeds that they're a drug dealer, they're a pedophile. The typical discreditation campaign that you see in the DOD, in the military.
Right, and are we not talking motive-wise, marginalization of one's views, for example, or vilify, nullify? It's okay. So there's a purpose behind this, and who are the victims? I mean, a typical victim. Who would that be?
Nobody, essentially. We've done through Freedom from Covert Surveillance and Harassment, we've done surveys of the victims to a large extent. So we do have some demographics, and 70% of the victims are female, usually 35 to 50. Most of them have also complained of sexual assault, physical sexual assault, as well as electronic sexual assault. Along with it, it doesn't seem to. It seems to be equal among Christian, non-Christian, black, white, racial lines. So basically, from the way it looks to most of us that are studying this scientifically, as if each perpetrator group in each major city that's been allowed access to this technology can use it carte blanche however they want to use it. But if you compile all the numbers together for the appropriate agency that's probably monitoring how this works, it ends up a random sample at the top.
So are we seeing somewhat of a, I don't know, maybe a random testing of this technology?
Essentially,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, essentially that's what we're seeing now. I do have seen a number of whistleblowers and I've had people come to visit me and talk to me in San Antonio that are former NSA, that are former CIA, that are former reconnaissance office, that are whistleblowers, that have certainly been victimized. And that's a pretty easy one. You know, when you hear their story and you hear, you know, what they blew the whistle on and now they're being victimized, at least you've got a reason. That's not the majority of the victims. The majority of the victims are professional people. The demographics that we've studied, most of these people have at least a high school degree. Most of them are college educated. A lot of them are professionals, doctors, lawyers, professional people. And they can pinpoint the date when they noticed the stalking, and they can pinpoint the date when they began to hear voices and experience directed energy attacks. So this isn't the classic case of a schizophrenic or someone with severe delusional disorder that, you know, when you get their history that, you know, they've kind of always not been quite right. You know, schizophrenia especially is overdiagnosed in this population. Schizophrenia in a male shows up at about 16 to 18, and a female can be a little bit later, but is usually at its peak by 20 or 21. You know, these are people that, you know, were successful, had professional lives, were making money, had families, you know, were functioning well with no history of mental illness, that all of a sudden at the age of 40 are hearing voices and, you know, being attacked, and most of them have good evidence of the stalking part of it. Pictures, photos.
Interesting. It brings me to mind that story with Vince Foster back in the 1990s, where that Patrick Knowlton, who found the body of Vince Foster and had described what he saw, which was inconsistent with what was revealed ultimately. And he was menaced by a group of individuals subsequent to his going public. And I remember it in real time listening to Gordon Liddy when Gordon Liddy had a talk show, and Knowlton went to him. I believe it was Knowlton that went to him. And Chris Ruddy, who wrote the book The Strange Death of Vince Foster, had spent time with Knowlton because he didn't believe him. He didn't believe that he was being menaced in this fashion. And what you're describing actually took place, you know, at that time. So, to a lesser extent, I don't know about the mind or the electronic aspect of it, but certainly the physical menacing of this individual did. So it's been around for a while, hasn't it?
Well, the organized stalking part has been around since COINTELPRO. You know, the FBI did that, you know, in the 60s to, you know, political groups that they found undesirable. You know, would, you know, leave notes or leave letters to a husband that appeared to be written by the wife, and, you know, to put stress in a relationship. You know, shut down bank accounts, you know, take money out of accounts, things like that, and basically to turn a group inward against each other. And, you know, that certainly is what the organized stalking part of it does. And we see that all the time with cell phone spoofing in these victims. Almost always it's a lot of times a married couple, and one will be victimized, and one is either non-victimized or at worst controlled. And the difference being that, you know, if I put voices in your head that sound like me, or a female voice, well, you know you're being harassed. If I put voices in your head that sound like your voice, you know, everybody, if you break down a thought process, you know, when you're reading a book, you're actually hearing your own voice in your head as you read. And if I put your voice in your head, then that becomes a thought. And a lot of people will act on that thought, and that's essentially how subliminal control works that way.
I can verify this, and this is something that I'm not necessarily proud of. Joe and I we've had occasion in the past being investigators, you know, in the private sector by profession, myself for over 2.5 decades. You know, cell phone spoofing, we've done that. I can tell you we've done that, and
it works beautifully.
It's an amazing, yes, and it's not something I'm proud of. And it was done when we did it. It was done for a specific purpose. It was limited to, well, I won't even get into it. But the fact is, it's easy to do. It doesn't. I mean, it's not that difficult to do. But what you're saying here is there's this. I believe you're saying that there's this huge operation. I mean, MK Ultra you mentioned. We really haven't, MK Ultra is still going on, isn't it?
Well, this is a continuation of MK Ultra. MK Ultra started right after the Korean War and was the almost a couple of hundred sub-projects of all geared at remotely controlling the human organism. And it went from as benign studies as just studying children's behavior patterns on playgrounds by visually surveilling them, all the way to Jose Delgado's STIMO receiver and chipping the brain and trying to control people by stimulating certain parts of the brain. And, I will tell you this is Jose Delgado, I think in the 80s, did an interview, and he actually was implanting brains to do his control. And as you probably know, he wrote a book called Electromagnetics to develop a psycho-civilized society. He's a firm believer that man should not be allowed to govern himself. That if we could chip all of us at birth, that would be the thing to do, and then have an elite at the top that can control the masses. He was a firm believer in that. And in the 80s, he actually came forth and said that, we've got the technology now where we no longer have to chip someone to do this kind of control, that it can be done by broadcasted frequency. And that was late 70s, early 80s. And amazingly enough, some of the earliest legitimate complaints that can be verified of people suffering from this were 5 or 6 prisoners from the Utah State Prison who in 85 to 90 came forward, wrote legal affidavits saying that they were put in solitary confinement where they noticed such a strong electromagnetic field in the room that a lot of them could not even get out of bed or get off the floor. They would try to stand and they couldn't. They all noticed tinnitus ringing in their ears, and the tinnitus slowly degraded to hearing voices. And of course, these guys, weren't exactly rocket scientists. They didn't know how to explain it, but they did notice that the voices that they were hearing seemed to be responding to their thoughts. That if they would think something bad, they would get zapped. If they would think whatever the voices were telling them to think, then they would be left alone for a little while and given a break from the torture. And this wasn't just one prisoner. This was 5 that wrote affidavits, and also talked about other prisoners who had experienced the same thing.
Okay. Well, how do you want to start with this? This is, to me, this is such a vast topic. Yeah, I mean, we can go into so many different directions and then end up in a lot of different rabbit holes.
To what's used to pull these different tactics off on people. We have a range from smart meters. You talk about satellites. We know the towers that they've put up, how it's done through magnetics, through frequencies. If we can get into that a little bit, I guess give us a basic breakdown on what you've experienced and researched.
And to start, I'll just give you a brief history of how I got involved with this, because I'm an anesthesiologist and a pain management physician.